The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains of Mabel's kitchen as she poured herself a cup of coffee. Outside, the familiar sounds of the farm filled the air, the low mooing of the cows, the distant hum of a tractor from the neighboring field. It was a life of routine, quiet and predictable, but it suited her. At 70 years old, Mabel had long accepted the solitude that came with living alone on the farm. Her husband had passed over a decade ago, and her children were scattered across the country, busy with their own lives. She had grown used to handling things on her own, but this time, she knew she was in over her head. The water pressure in the kitchen sink had dwindled to a mere trickle, and the pipes beneath the sink had started leaking. She'd tried tightening the connections herself, but the problem only seemed to worsen. Sighing, she picked up the phone and dialed the number of the local handyman. "Hi, this is Mabel Harper," she said when the line connected. "I've got a bit of a plumbing issue and could use some help." The voice on the other end was warm and reassuring. "Of course, Mrs. Harper. I'll swing by this afternoon to take a look." True to his word, the handyman arrived later that day. Mabel was in the garden when she heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the house, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of the young man stepping out of the truck. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a confident gait. His dark hair was tousled, and a friendly smile lit up his face as he approached her. "You must be Mrs. Harper," he said, extending a hand. "I'm Jack." "That's me," she replied, shaking his hand. "And please call me Mabel." "All right, Mabel," he said with a grin. "Let's see what we're dealing with." As Jack knelt beneath the kitchen sink, inspecting the pipes, Mabel found herself studying him more closely than she intended. There was something about the way he moved, his steady hands, the slight furrow of his brow as he worked, that drew her attention. "It's a simple fix," he said, glancing up at her. "You've got some old seals that need replacing, and I'll tighten everything up while I'm at it." "Thank you," she said, offering a small smile. "I've tried to keep this place running on my own, but sometimes it's a bit much." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "You've done a great job. Most people would have let a place like this fall apart, but you've kept it in great shape." His words warmed her more than she cared to admit. "Well, thank you for saying that," she said, her cheeks flushing slightly. As the afternoon wore on, Jack worked diligently, replacing seals and testing the water pressure. Mabel hovered nearby, offering him lemonade and chatting about the farm. "You've got a beautiful place here," he said, glancing out the window at the sprawling fields. "It keeps me busy," she replied. "Some days, it feels like too much for one person." "Ever thought about hiring help?" he asked, his tone curious. She shrugged. "I've thought about it, but it feels strange having someone else here. This place has always been my responsibility." Jack nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Still, everyone needs a little help now and then." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them felt charged, though neither of them acknowledged it. By the time Jack finished the repairs, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the kitchen. "All done," he said, turning the faucet on to demonstrate the restored water pressure. "Thank you," Mabel said, her smile genuine. "You've been a lifesaver." "It's my job," he replied with a wink. As he gathered his tools, Mabel hesitated, then spoke. "I don't suppose you'd have time to take a look at the upstairs bathroom? The shower's been acting up lately." Jack glanced at his watch, then nodded. "Sure, I've got time. Lead the way." Mabel led him upstairs, her heart inexplicably racing as they stepped into the small, sunlit bathroom. Jack crouched to inspect the showerhead, his movements deliberate and precise. "This one's a little clogged," he said, unscrewing the fixture. "Looks like it just needs a good cleaning." She stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "You really know your stuff," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. Jack glanced at her, his smile soft. "Been doing this a long time. You pick up a thing or two?" As he worked, Mabel found herself relaxing, her usual guarded demeanor giving way to something she couldn't quite name. When he finished, he turned to her, his expression warm. "Good as new," he said, stepping back to admire his work. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the space between them seemed to shrink. But then Jack cleared his throat, breaking the spell. Well, he said, gathering his tools. If there's nothing else, I'll get out of your hair. Of course, Mabel said quickly, her cheeks flushing. Thank you again, Jack. Any time, he replied, his smile lingering as he headed for the door. That night, as Mabel lay in bed, her thoughts kept returning to Jack. The warmth of his smile, the steadiness of his hands, the way his presence had made her feel less alone, if only for an afternoon. She tried to dismiss the thoughts as foolish, but they lingered, leaving her with a strange sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The next day, as Mabel went about her morning chores, she found her thoughts wandering back to Jack. It was silly, she told herself. He was just a handyman doing his job, and yet there was something about him, his warmth, his easy confidence, that lingered in her mind. By mid-morning, the kitchen phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. She wiped her hands on a towel and picked up the receiver. "Hi, Mrs. Harper," Jack's voice came through, cheerful as ever. "Jack," she said, surprised. "What can I do for you?" "Just wanted to check in," he said. "I was thinking about that shower I fixed yesterday, and I realized I didn't check the pressure as thoroughly as I should have. Mind if I swing by to take another look?" Mabel hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. "Oh, you don't have to do that. It seemed fine to me." "Better safe than sorry," he replied. "I'll be there in an hour." "All right," she said, her voice soft. "See you then." Jack arrived right on time, his truck rumbling up the driveway. Mabel met him at the door, trying to ignore the flutter in her chest as he stepped inside, his tool bag slung over one shoulder. "Thanks for letting me come back," he said, his smile easy. "Of course," she replied, leading him upstairs. This time, as he worked on the shower, Mabel found herself relaxing in his presence. They chatted about the farm, his work, and the little quirks of small-town life. "You must get called out to a lot of places," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Yeah, keeps me busy," he replied, tightening a connection. "But I like it. Every job's a little different." When he finished, he turned to her, his expression warm. "Looks good now. Shouldn't give you any more trouble." "Thank you, Jack," she said, her smile genuine. "I don't know what I'd do without you." He chuckled, his gaze lingering on her. "Just doing my job, Mabel." As they walked back downstairs, Jack hesitated at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "You know," he said, glancing at her, "I've been meaning to grab lunch, but I never got around to it. Any good places nearby?" Mabel hesitated, then smiled. "Not really, but I could make you something if you'd like." "I wouldn't want to impose," he said quickly. "It's no trouble," she replied, already heading to the kitchen. Jack followed, setting his tool bag by the door as she pulled ingredients from the fridge. He offered to help, and before long, they were working side by side, slicing vegetables and buttering bread. "You're pretty handy in the kitchen," she said, glancing at him. "My mom taught me," he replied, a hint of nostalgia in his voice. "Said every man should know how to cook at least one decent meal." "Well, I'd say you're ahead of the curve," she said, smiling. They sat together at the small kitchen table, the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. The conversation flowed easily, their laughter filling the room as they swapped stories. "You've got a great laugh," Jack said at one point, his tone sincere. "Thank you," Mabel replied, feeling her cheeks warm. "It's been a while since I've had this much fun." "Glad I could help," he said, his smile soft. When the meal was finished, Jack insisted on washing the dishes, and Mabel found herself watching him as he worked, the easy way he moved making her chest tighten. "You're full of surprises," she said. He turned to her, his smile playful. "That's what they tell me." As Jack gathered his things to leave, the air between them felt heavier, though neither of them acknowledged it. "Thanks again for lunch," he said, his hand lingering on the doorknob. "Anytime," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to fade away. But then Jack cleared his throat, stepping outside. "Take care, Mabel," he said, his smile lingering as he headed to his truck. You too, she whispered, watching as he drove away. That evening, as Mabel sat on the porch, the memory of Jack's smile played over and over in her mind. She told herself it was just a passing fancy, a harmless crush, but deep down, she knew it was more than that. The quiet of the farm seemed emptier than usual, the solitude pressing down on her in a way it hadn't before. She found herself hoping, against all reason, that Jack might find another excuse to come back. Her wish was granted sooner than she expected. The next morning, as she sipped her coffee, the phone rang again. "Morning, Mrs. Harper," Jack said, his voice warm. "Good morning, Jack," she replied, her heart fluttering. "What can I do for you?" "I was thinking," he began, hesitating for a moment. "If you ever need help around the farm, I've got some free time this week. Thought I'd offer my services." Mabel smiled, her chest tightening with a mix of excitement and nerves. "That's very kind of you. I could use a hand with a few things." "Great," he said. "I'll be there this afternoon." As she hung up the phone, Mabel felt a strange sense of anticipation, her heart racing at the thought of seeing him again. That afternoon, Jack arrived as promised, his truck kicking up a small cloud of dust as it rolled into the driveway. Mabel was already waiting on the porch, her heart skipping a beat at the sight of him stepping out, his easy smile lighting up his face. "Where do we start?" he asked, slinging his tool bag over his shoulder as he approached. "There's a loose board on the back porch," Mabel said. "It's been tripping me up for weeks." "Let's fix that first," Jack replied, his tone confident. The back porch was bathed in golden afternoon light as Jack worked on the loose board. Mabel stood nearby, handing him nails and chatting about the quirks of the old farmhouse. "This place has seen better days," she said, her tone fond. "It's got character," Jack replied, glancing up at her with a smile. "It's a nice way to say it's falling apart," she teased. He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, I mean it. Places like this have a soul. You can feel the history in the walls." His words surprised her, and for a moment, she found herself looking at him differently. "You've got a way with words, Jack," she said softly. He straightened, brushing the dust from his hands. "All done," he said, stepping back to admire his work. "Thank you," Mabel said, her smile warm. "Anything else on the list?" he asked, his tone playful. "Well," she said, hesitating for a moment. "The barn door sticks sometimes. If you've got the time—" "I've always got time for you, Mabel," he said, his voice low. Her cheeks flushed, and she quickly looked away. The barn was cool and dim, the scent of hay and wood filling the air. Jack worked on the door, testing the hinges and planing down the edges until it slid smoothly along the track. "You make it look easy," Mabel said, leaning against a wooden beam. "It's all about patience," Jack replied, flashing her a grin. She watched him work, her thoughts racing. There was something about his presence, his calm, steady energy, that made her feel more alive than she had in years. When he finished, he turned to her, his smile soft. "Anything else?" "Not today," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Good," he said, stepping closer. "You've been working hard enough as it is." She laughed, the sound light and genuine. "You don't have to flatter me, Jack." "I'm not," he said, his gaze steady. The air between them felt heavier, charged, but neither of them moved. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mabel invited Jack to stay for dinner. "It's the least I can do after all your help," she said. "I'd like that," he replied, his smile warm. They cooked together in the small kitchen, their movements easy and natural. Jack chopped vegetables while Mabel stirred a pot on the stove, their conversation flowing effortlessly. "You're a good cook," she said as he handed her a plate of neatly chopped carrots. "Thanks," he replied. "But I think you've got me beat." Dinner was simple but satisfying, and they lingered at the table long after the food was gone, talking and laughing like old friends. As they sat on the porch after dinner, the cool night air wrapping around them, Mabel found herself opening up in a way she hadn't in years. "It's been a long time since I've had someone here," she admitted, her voice soft. Jack looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You deserve to have people around, Mabel. You've got too much to give to spend your days alone." His words struck a chord, and she felt tears prick at her eyes. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice trembling. "For what?" "For being kind," she replied. "For reminding me what it feels like to be seen." He reached out then, his hand brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt through her, and she quickly pulled back, her cheeks flushing. "Sorry," she murmured, her heart racing. "It's okay," he said softly. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable." "You didn't," she said quickly, though her voice wavered. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. When it was time for Jack to leave, Mabel walked him to his truck, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and longing. "Thank you for everything today," she said, her voice sincere. "Any time," he replied, his smile soft. As he climbed into the truck, he hesitated, his gaze meeting hers. "If you ever need anything at all, just call me, okay?" "I will," she said, her heart pounding. He nodded, then started the engine, the sound rumbling through the quiet night. Mabel watched as his taillights disappeared down the driveway, her thoughts a whirlwind of emotions she couldn't quite name. That night, as she lay in bed, Mabel couldn't stop thinking about Jack. The warmth of his smile, the steadiness of his hands, the way he had looked at her as though she were the only person in the world. She told herself it was silly, that nothing could ever come of it. But the thought of seeing him again filled her with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The following morning, Mabel woke with a strange sense of purpose. The house felt quieter than usual, and the tasks of the day loomed ahead of her like any other. Yet, her thoughts remained tethered to Jack, his voice, his laugh, the way his presence seemed to fill the emptiness she hadn't even realized she was carrying. She busied herself with chores, trying to push the thoughts aside, but the knock at the door startled her out of her reverie. When she opened it, there he was, Jack, standing on the porch with his easy smile and that same tool bag slung over his shoulder. "Morning," he said, tipping his cap. "Jack," she said, her surprise evident. "I wasn't expecting you." "I hope I'm not intruding," he said. "I was in the area, and thought I'd check in. See if you needed anything." For a moment, she hesitated, her heart racing. "Well, there's always something to do around here," she said, stepping aside to let him in. This time, they tackled the creaky steps leading up to the attic. It was a small thing, but Mabel had been putting it off for years, unsure how to fix them herself. As Jack worked, she stood nearby, handing him tools and chatting about the quirks of the old house. "This place has seen a lot of life," he said, his tone thoughtful. "It has," Mabel replied. "Some good, some less so." Jack glanced at her, his expression soft. "You've made it a home, though. That's something to be proud of." "Thank you," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the attic felt smaller, the air heavier. But then Jack turned back to his work, and the spell was broken. As they descended the attic stairs, Mabel hesitated at the bottom, her thoughts racing. "Jack," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Would you like to stay for dinner again? It's the least I can do after all your help." Jack smiled, his expression warm. "I'd like that." Dinner was simple: roast chicken, fresh vegetables from the garden, and a bottle of wine Mabel had been saving for no particular reason. They talked and laughed as they ate, the evening passing in a comfortable blur. "You know," Jack said as they lingered at the table, "you've got a way of making a guy feel at home." Mabel laughed, shaking her head. "It's just dinner." "No," he said, his tone soft. "It's more than that." Later, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Jack turned to her, his expression serious. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course," Mabel said, her heart skipping a beat. "Do you ever get lonely out here?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But I've gotten used to it." "You shouldn't have to," he said, his gaze steady. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, Mabel didn't know how to respond. "It's not so bad," she said finally, her voice trembling. Jack reached out then, his hand brushing against hers. "You deserve more than not so bad, Mabel." Her breath caught, and she looked away, her thoughts a whirlwind. Jack, You don't have to say anything, he said quickly, pulling back. I just wanted you to know. That night, as Mabel lay in bed, her thoughts were consumed by Jack's words. He'd seen through her carefully constructed defenses, peeling back the layers she'd spent years building to protect herself. She told herself it was foolish, that nothing could come of it. But deep down, she knew she didn't want him to leave. The next evening, as Mabel was tidying up the kitchen, she heard the familiar rumble of Jack's truck in the driveway. Her heart leapt, and she quickly smoothed her apron before opening the door. Jack, she said, surprised. I didn't expect to see you again so soon. Hope you don't mind, he said, smiling. I thought I'd check in one last time before the week gets too busy. Not at all, she said, stepping aside to let him in. They spent the evening talking, the conversation flowing easily as it always did. But there was a new tension between them, an unspoken understanding that neither dared to address. As the night wore on, Jack hesitated at the door, his hand resting on the frame. I should go, he said, his voice soft. You don't have to, Mabel said before she could stop herself. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to fall away. Slowly, Jack stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers. Mabel, he began, his voice trembling. It's okay, she said softly, her heart pounding. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them heavy with unspoken emotions. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. I don't want to cross a line, he whispered. You're not, she said, her voice barely audible. The next few moments passed in a blur, their actions tentative yet charged with a depth of emotion neither could deny. They didn't speak, letting the silence and the weight of their connection fill the space between them. When Jack finally pulled back, his gaze was steady, his expression filled with a mix of longing and uncertainty. I should go, he said again, his voice breaking. Mabel nodded, though her chest ached at the thought of him leaving. Take care, Jack, she said softly. You too, he replied, his eyes lingering on her before he stepped out into the night. The next day, Mabel woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, but the light didn't chase away the lingering heaviness in her chest. Jack's absence was palpable, the memory of their quiet moment on the porch replaying over and over in her mind. She moved through her chores mechanically, the usual rhythm of the farm failing to soothe her nerves. By midday, she found herself glancing toward the driveway, hoping for the familiar rumble of Jack's truck, though she knew better than to expect it. When the phone rang, she nearly jumped out of her skin. Rushing to answer it, she tried to steady her breath. Mabel? Jack's voice came through the line, warm and steady. Jack, she said, relief flooding her. I wasn't expecting to hear from you. I couldn't stop thinking about last night, he admitted. I just needed to make sure you're okay. I'm fine, she said, though her voice betrayed her emotions. How about you? I don't know, he said honestly, but I'd like to figure it out. Can I come by? Her heart skipped a beat. Of course. Jack arrived an hour later, his truck kicking up a small cloud of dust as it pulled into the driveway. Mabel was waiting for him on the porch, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. As he stepped out of the truck, their eyes met, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Hi, he said finally, his voice soft. Hi, she replied, her heart racing. Jack climbed the steps, stopping just short of her. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, he said. You're not, she said quickly. He searched her face, his expression a mix of longing and hesitation. This is new for me, Mabel, he admitted. I don't know where we go from here. Neither do I, she said, her voice trembling. But I know I don't want you to go. His shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded. Then let's figure it out together. They spent the afternoon talking, their words raw and unfiltered. Mabel shared stories of her late husband, the struggles of running the farm alone, and the quiet loneliness that had become her constant companion. Jack opened up about his restless nature, his struggles to find meaning in his work, and the unexpected comfort he'd found in her company. I didn't expect this, he said, his voice low. You've made me see things differently. You've done the same for me, Mabel said softly. As the sun set, they found themselves sitting on the porch again, the cool breeze carrying the scent of wildflowers. What happens now? Mabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack reached for her hand, his touch warm and steady. We take it one day at a time, he said. The days that followed were a mix of quiet moments and shared tasks, their connection growing stronger with each passing day. Jack began spending more time at the farm, helping with repairs and chores, his presence becoming a comforting routine. One evening, as they worked together in the garden, Jack paused, leaning on his shovel. You've got a way of making a man feel at home, he said, his tone light but sincere. Mabel laughed, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. Maybe you just belong here. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Not everyone in town was as welcoming of their growing closeness. Mrs. Harper, the ever-watchful neighbor, paid an unannounced visit one morning, her sharp eyes scanning the yard as she stepped onto the porch. Mabel, she said, her tone polite but probing. It's good to see you. I've noticed Jack's truck here quite a bit lately. He's been helping with the farm, Mabel replied evenly. Kind of him, Mrs. Harper said, her gaze lingering. You know how people talk. Let them, Mabel said firmly, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Mrs. Harper's smile was thin, her curiosity clearly unsatisfied. Take care, dear, she said before leaving. As Mabel watched her walk away, she felt a wave of unease. When Jack arrived later that day, she told him about the visit. She's just nosy, he said, his tone dismissive. Don't let her get to you. I won't, Mabel said, though the encounter left her with a lingering sense of worry. That evening, as they sat by the fire, Jack turned to her, his expression serious. Are you sure about this? He asked. About us? She replied, her heart racing. He nodded. I don't want to make your life harder, Mabel. You make it better, she said simply. His gaze softened, and he reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. Then we'll figure it out. Together. Together, she echoed, her voice steady. The weeks that followed were filled with quiet moments of joy and shared work. The whispers from town faded into the background as Mabel and Jack focused on building something meaningful between them. One evening, as they stood on the porch watching the stars, Jack turned to her, his expression thoughtful. I've been thinking, he said. About what? Mabel asked, her chest tightening. About staying, he said, his voice steady. Making this place my home. Tears filled her eyes as she smiled. I'd like that, she said softly. Jack pulled her into a warm embrace, and for the first time in years, Mabel felt truly whole.